Okay, welcome to part two here. Now, I last left off talking about the RGE Spy Institute. There's a lot there because here we have the origins, understanding what happened. The difference as we go through the calendar of history and we go from basically communism and socialism essentially fading away to all of a sudden coming back into play in a brand new way. And what changes here, the big game changer, is RGE Spy Institute. This is where you have a government come in partnerships with various private entities of means to be able to weaponize something on a level that's mind-blowing. This is where you have people that are on the roles as spies. So you have Karl Marx as a spy on the payroll, where his material is not legitimate. It's a construct. It was developed by an entire nation spy department in conjunction with other outside partnerships where you have co-conspirators. So this is something that took a very long time for many people to assemble. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And a lot of what gets assembled comes from fragments. But because we fought two great wars, basically with the Royal German Empire, its manipulations of the political spectrum, not only in relationship to Europe, but in relationship to Russia, Asia, and the United States, literally to the entire world. So a lot of information that was captured out of these wars and captured by counter-espionage units was basically held in trust for a long time. There were problems with it. Number one, we had huge lists that were captured involving parties who were on the spy rolls. When you end up getting a hold of the columns, the tracking, the banking information, who they paid money to, who were the sources, how do you communicate with them, what is the background association file cards associated with different people, so that when you could have different salespeople or various parties end up communicating with other people, you would have these cards at minimum that had key information on them, so they could relay certain references in relation to communication. This is standard to sales, basically. Many people would realize this in sales, that you have a profile, so to speak, and you have a conversation tracking agenda respective to different people. So this is something that was all housed for the most part in some way with the RGE Spy Institute. Now, a lot of this was also done in conjunction with other companies. We seized information, we found information at chemical plant companies, pharmaceutical companies. We got a hold of enormous yields as we captured lots of data, because we literally had times over the span of all of this where we caught basically chemical plants and munitions companies working together, building explosives and devices that ended up killing our own people. Not a pleasant thing to discover, to say, oh my goodness, the bombs were made right here in America and they're killing our own people. And this is something that became quite a thing in Revelations respective to World War I, for instance. So, as we move forward with this deep analysis, there were other things that were important. When you discover the potential information that indicated that leadership in America, that there were bribes, literally, bribes paid to various people. This becomes problematic when you have people that intercept data that are in a situation where At that point in time, they didn't have a lot of resources, and they're trying to put together the big picture and understand who's who and what's what. So you had a lot of information that ended up basically getting filed away because it wasn't that it wasn't necessarily actionable. It was, how big is the expense going to be? Is there justification for the expense? Because if you think about it, it's a hard thing to go to Congress and say, "Oh, well, we need more money to, fund counter espionage and various, investigations regarding." We have a list, because Congress is going to turn around. The Senate, the Congress are going to turn around and say, "Well, we would like to see a list of what it is you're investigating." And this is really important, because if you hand them a list that has their names on it, some of these people are going to kind of sort of like flip out. And this may not be a healthy thing. So this means that there were certain investigation arms, so to speak, that were not pursued. They were kind of set off to the side. In fact, you ended up having money being diverted sometimes to do other investigation, and then justified as a sideline that just happened to be loose ends that popped up, and we had to investigate those, but they ended up going nowhere or whatever. But yeah, here's the book value on it. And we pursued this, and we only found this information, it would seem. And so they would actually hide some of the data that they would find respective to some of these areas, because it was so controversial to say, if you don't have a whole lot of information, you don't want to step up and accuse a congressman or a senator of something unless you have a lot more information. So this factor of hidden information continued forward even to the McCarthy era. So when you have McCarthy era, he ended up going after all of these different people, respectively, that were associating with different people. And he had a lot of actors and actresses and whatnot. And McCarthy made several mistakes. Some people have noted them. I don't want to spend too much time into it. But among the things that he kept forgetting and he didn't understand is that anybody who walked up and had a nice jacket on that would show up at an industry party, somebody that's, yeah, we're in the entertainment industry and we have an investor party here. Well, people would see the ads, or and they would show up and they'd have a nice suit on. They go, "Are you an investor?" And the guy'd pull out an envelope full of cash and go and spread it out and say, "Well, what do you think?" And then put it back in his lapel there. And people go, "Oh, yes, right this way, sir." So you had a lot of people that would get basically invited by the sheer factor they were door crashing. And in some cases, yeah, they get invited. Some salesperson or whatever, they would, validate the fact that these people had money, and then they would go after them in certain ways to say, "Yes, we are going to pursue you because you're an investor, you have money, you're invited, please show up." Well, you have other people that made different observations, and the government ended up finding different factors. So here you have McCarthy getting all upset, going, "Why are these communists showing up at these filmmaker parties, etc., so forth?" And he didn't really understand the nature of the way business worked, because it was actually very simple. It's very cut and dry. We're in business to be business, and we put out ads, and we have salespeople we hire to literally find us investors. And we don't do the deepest research in this area. Nobody ever told us it was required. I mean, it's fairly simple. Basically, we're talking about, we need investors. That's people with money, and we would like them to show up. You don't do certain things to people, or they won't like you. In other words, can we do a cavity check? Can we get you to pull your pants down, and we just want to see if you're smuggling drugs in the door? Obviously, that's not something you could do at the party. Well, there's a whole lot of things you couldn't do at the party if you are a filmmaker attracting investors. It's very simple. Their credentials are, look, I have cash. I'm a potential investor. And they'd go, oh, yes, right this way, folks. So McCarthy didn't really quite get it as to understanding that anybody that would put up the facade or illusion that they have cash could end up basically getting invited to places. So this was part of the big problem that occurred respective at that era, in that time. There's more to it than that, but there were certain things that McCarthy did know. But guess what? He was really not allowed to disclose certain things, classified. So it took a number of years for more information to end up getting released, or let's just say basically more people who are historians to finally get access to certain information. And there's still vast quantities of information that are literally in warehouses all over the world. You have information that's in Britain and France and all over the place. All kinds of information pertaining to different captured information from one sort or another. Now, as time moves forward, you eventually get more and more historians that discover things. And there are many other factors that didn't necessarily get revealed, because there's always that factor that deals with you don't relay certain information because you're still investigating things. And that means you don't want certain people to know that you're onto them. This is very important to investigations. So a lot of people just don't get these factors and understand how long it can take sometimes to do certain types of investigations. A lot of frustration there, because you literally had more information than there was funding available respective to investigating people. And it's kind of not a joke there, because you literally end up with a situation of people getting away by virtue of there wasn't enough money and personnel to basically track people down and discern their involvement. So these are factors that become more important later on as we go through time. As we go through time and we discover more things, we are now at a brand new area where more information keeps popping up. Wonderful, juicy fragments pop up. Historians find it. And there's yet again even more information that is still considered classified, that is literally in a different warehouse, a different set of rooms, that reveals yet again even more information. And then you have the extensions respective to other countries as well in these areas. So, it's somewhat complicated, but there are certain times when you run into certain information and it's just inescapable. So the overall understanding that Joseph Stalin, Lenin, Karl Marx, all on the Royal German Empire Spy Institute payroll. This is undeniable. Yet they were also on syndicate payroll. In other words, and in some cases, multiple other payrolls with other parties. So this means that you have this strange bedfellowism that they are in business with the oligarchs. So you end up realizing that, wow, Lenin was actually an oligarch. And these people were also oligarchs. Stalin becomes an oligarch. So this is something that many people are confused about. They're like, oh, wait a minute, what's what? And into all of this, you have to track the base understandings such as, oh my goodness, look how many mass murders have occurred. Oh my goodness, the data that, for instance, Joseph Stalin utilized was obtained by the RGE Spy Institute in its various exploits to basically get a hold of what? The data, all the doctor's records. And this connects to various types of universities, etc. So here we have these cross connections involving new types of techniques that were developed in the 1800s that today people would think, oh, yeah, that kind of stuff happens all the time. No surprise here. But back then, it was a surprise. It was really a big deal. So you had an incredible leeway in understanding the truth about all of these incredibly powerful capabilities if you were in the inside. So you'd have various levels of disclosure, and then again, a lot of things kind of sort of on a need to know. So you had a lot of people that were involved in things at different levels that didn't need to know, and they didn't know, but they were still on board. So there you have your different levels, different things that occur. And the reoccurrence of the remanifestation of the Royal German Empire is also backing Hitler, ultimately, because they like to manipulate all the puppets in a city, all the puppets in a country. And it's a form of puppeting. Now, the Russians have always mentioned things about puppeting. And one of the things about some of these strong sayings that the Russians had basically came from RGE books, spy books, training books, because eventually these books would get passed to different people, and different people would end up screwing up, and other people would get a hold of it, and some people would flat out change their mind. So you would have different forms of information eventually getting into other people's hands. Not to mention some people were just, well, actually brilliant. That's always a factor. And one of the reasons that Stalin murdered so many people is they wanted to control people. The idea is we want to make sure that all these people are going to be good workers. They're going to be good pawns. They're not going to be into self-sustaining themselves. We want to control everything about them. So here's where you see the modern versions of this manifesting, and you'll see leadership even in America. You have basically senator, you have different people, you have oh darn it, what's his name there? He's I just caught his lecture the other day. Wait a minute. So you actually have Senator Sanders constantly being accused of basically being a communist and a socialism. And he's kind of self-proclaimed as a socialist, you could say. But there are issues here. There are very big issues because if you evaluate many of his speeches, you could sit there and say, gee, his people do really this incredibly good job coming up with statistics on things, for health and whatnot, except there's a problem with the well-roundedness. He doesn't have all this well-roundedness and understanding. He's lacking. He's seriously lacking in understanding things like the front end to make sure that you have a balanced money situation, respect for certain things, Yet his speeches and his activities are very popular with students. Because students want they want education paid for, they want medical paid for. So there's a very heavy backing, so to speak, in many of the things that he talks about. Except there's also this problem that Sanders finds himself in dangerous territory. Among these territories was his backing of, for instance, Julie Sue, where he actually thought that he was looking at good material, but he'd been duped. He's looking at packets of information, and he, in fact, has been duped by Julie Sue. She's looking at all this as, oh, she has all these references. Well, these references were all from different union people, but how do these references pertain to her actual job performance? See, this is part of the problem, because when you end up having the Senate looking at things, they discover
we looked at your communication records, and you're not talking with business leaders. You're not talking with other business people. You're not talking with candidates running for office. You're not talking with people who are trying to get in touch with you over very important matters. So she's got a very closed door policy. And in fact, what she ended up participating in was mass blacklisting. You ended up having 1.2 million people basically saying, hey, where's my money? And people end up looking at it and say, well, this is fraud. These people's money was stolen. Congress ordered this money to be available for these people to compensate them because of COVID. But instead, Julie Su took a list of these people's names, submitted it to government. The government gave her money to pay them, and then she absconded with the money and started to do her own thing with it. So in other words, here we have 1.2 million plus people in California that were entitled to compensation that all of a sudden got blacklisted. And this is horrible. These are people who are losing their homes. These are people that are having their businesses disintegrate. A vast array of people, and people like myself. I have archives. They've attacked the financial core, shutting down an archive, and I can't get any compensation, not even for my basic labor, when I do multiple types of gig work. COVID was brutal because here I would have different types of gig work that I would do from time to time that had an association with basically the archive. And the archive would run in different ways where, truthfully, in many cases, I was kind of doing a lot of volunteering and not getting what many people would call a full paycheck because of all these different mysterious types of expenses that many people don't understand exist unless you've been in business yourself. And then you would understand that you can have all these different types of mysterious expenses. So the numbers essentially can be deceiving in many cases. It's just one of those things. So here I am as an archiver and basically a candidate running for office, and the very core, the very financial rug of the camp is shut down, which of course is a problem because the Constitution and Articles say that you cannot attack the financial rug, the financial core of a candidate. You can't do that because that is one way somebody would be able to manipulate and rig elections, which is exactly what has been happening in California because they cut off people's income and they shut them down. And what happens? Well, if you're shut down and they've shut down, let's say, all of your gig work, all of your appearances, all of your different ways that you would normally use to run your operations, something happens. And what ends up happening is you have no more money coming in, which means you end up with other things that can happen. What if you have security problems, which of course are things that also occurred. So we end up having eventually security problems coming about, and regardless of how many communications there would be with various parties throughout the state of California, the answers were still the same. We can't help you. We're busy. Go someplace else. Try somebody else. So mass dereliction of duty is what ends up happening. And the more investigations that occur, the more all of a sudden you find mass fraud. And that's kind of part of where we're at on some of these things. We have the White House now investigating mass fraud that occurred during COVID. And this is, again, quite a situation. But when you get to certain people, it gets worse. There's more things that went wrong with more people's lives in certain areas, and mysteriously, this candidate and this archiver ended up having more problems concerning the blacklisting. And the investigations were very fruitful. In fact, there were numerous investigations. When you look at things like there were multiple Senate hearings concerning Julie Sue, and were incredible facts that were coming out. You even had the United States Secret Service investigating and confirming different facts about Julie Sue and her involvement and how she's continuously connected to mass fraud. So this is a serious situation. Many people were just looking and saying, okay, well, maybe it's just incompetence. Other people were saying, well, it seems to be far more than that. So when you have situations of parties that do things, then they can do mass demographic attacks, mass sabotage attacks, and literally influence the process of elections. But you have basically people like Sanders that were ignoring it until all of a sudden it would blatantly come into his face. And you'd be able to see him in hearings all of a sudden literally realize that a bunch of information popped up. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. My information was missing that. I seem to be missing this entire line of information, which means he's embarrassed. So he starts off with, in some instances, endorsing Julie Sue, trying to endorse Julie Sue, but then the questions become more and more embarrassing, respective to the reality about Julie Sue and what she's involved in. Yet we have a lacking at a severe level regarding the conclusions that Sanders has made in relationship to whatever or however his education has apparently evolved, because he ends up endorsing things in various ways and various plans to the point where, what is he? Well, the symmetry reveals him to be an oligarch. He is backing oligarchy. He is backing communists and socialists to control all the money and make their own oligarchs, as he's telling everybody else, be a good worker. Be a good worker, be a good wage slave, be a good pawn. So you don't see any diversity for him pushing for actual success, actual ways to develop and make lots of money. He is participating in long-term scholastic education with no guarantee that there's actually going to be money. And this is a serious item because original constitutional, colonial constitutional capitalism has growth being a permanent guaranteed item where all parties are supposed to have permanent access to the United States Treasury, which controlled the money and the land and the printing and making of notes. So basically you would have people that many of which were actually Christians that adhered to Christ the Carpenter type philosophies. I don't know how many people out there really understand what that means. It's growth based. It's you build stuff with your own hands at the rate that you can go ahead and do it. So this is a very important factor for many people to be able to involve themselves in building things. So an example at a modern level, for instance, if you were to approach and interview people that, let's say, illegal aliens, the guy says he's a carpenter, and you say, okay, if I have the land and all the permits ready to go and the materials, and I give you one helper, I want you to tell me how good of a carpenter you are. How many 2 or 3 bedroom homes could you build me in the course of a year? Again, we've got all the lands ready to go, all the permits are paid, it's just ready to go. All you have to do is take this helper and just build. And the guy looks at you and thinks for a moment and says, oh, senor, I'm a good carpenter. I can build you 3 homes like that in a year. 3 homes easy. So this is something that you would probably find repeatedly. At least I did when you go out, you interview people. So here we have a series of facts where you have Senator Sanders missing part of the understanding of what the original constitutional contract is. And there were lots of them. We're on Constitution number 5, actually. And there were many contracts that were already signed, endorsed, and people were up front. You know, we understand you're making another deal to get another state to join, and they want some small changes, but if you basically invalidate the contracts that we have with you, we're out. So keeping everybody together was quite a unique dancing act, so to speak, because you have people that want to continue with their promise, their guarantees for growth, for building, for access to money, for weapons, for keeping their militia rights and powers. So this is something that's crucially important, and many people don't know. And you have people running around talking about gun control at levels where it's simply just not allowed. It's not legal. It's not constitutional. And to basically try to do it is to invalidate that those parties or states or local governments' authority or power respective to federal participation. In other words, if you have states or cities that say, oh, well, we're going to go ahead and secede, and we're not going to allow anybody to have guns anywhere in our city ever, they would be basically invalidating their right to get any form of federal money. They will have been parties who are seceded from the federal constitution and agreement. This is something that is a situational problem, respect to what some people would do. And of course, we generally have certain laws to say we're not going to allow parties to secede anymore. That's something where we decided to say, no, we're really not going to allow that, so to speak. There are various issues over it. Now, depending on what you feel or believe about this, because you do have states that end up splitting themselves into North and South, etc. These situations can occur over the course of time, but still you end up with a federal tie. So we're coming to a situation where serious poisoning, serious activity that literally has its origins from the Royal German Empire becomes important. It becomes important because you have people that were handed orders at the RGE Spy Institute where they said, okay, we need to come up with a series of mechanisms to destabilize people. We need more ways to control people. We need more ways to waste people's time. We need more ways to destroy people's efficiency because we want to weaken them so we can use these other types of invented constraints to eventually take mass advantage and begin stealing their stuff and make it look as though it's their fault and they're criminals and somehow they're not complying with perfectly reasonable requests. So when you have these kind of construct instructions at the RGE Spy Institute, you end up having people, all of these people, keep in mind, they have extreme educations. And they're basically diabolically opposing what? They're into their own success, and they're into controlling every possible facet on the board that they can, on the tactical table. Whether it's a government or a city, they want to control everything. They want to puppet everything. So they come up with all of these different types of game plans to basically run different types of political factions. so that they can control everything and know effectively when and where any of this stuff is going to occur. They don't want surprises. They want the data. They want to have people infiltrated in every level of all of these different organizations, because that way they will know who is not happy with who, and this data becomes, well, incredibly valuable. That means that they can continue to use this data to manipulate situations. That's a very powerful position. So when you have all of these origin items that deal with the fact that there is before weaponization of certain belief systems, there is the new created communism and socialism. This is, RGE Spy Institute creations in conjunction with their partners who give, who are sponsoring these people for many, many years. So you can go all the way back to Karl Marx. And again, Karl Marx was on the payroll. Karl Marx was a spy. Karl Marx was having the RGE Spy Institute basically work with creating constructs, mass constructs. And from these mass construct understandings, various types of books were being assembled. And Karl Marx was not the only one. There were other people that also were basically having material data. Once again, we're back to what? Data engineering, data management, data manipulation. Why? To manipulate people. Why? Because you're going to puppet them. It's pretty a lot easier once you get to understand what's going on at these different levels. All of a sudden, a lot of these other items start making more and more sense. So now you can start readily putting pieces of the puzzle together, because now the framework is together at a completely different level. You can start working with it far more practically. So now you can understand all these interesting things, so like, for instance, the concepts of code enforcement. People are like, well, what are the origins of code enforcement? Well, I'll tell you, the origins actually of code enforcement are RGE. They were developed by the RGE Spy Institute, and they made a series of books and designs and mechanisms that they wanted to run with, because these are things that they would use in many ways. One way is they would use them as issues to gain support. And so they would be doing things like divide and conquer different people by inventing all of these mechanisms that other people might like. And they would take on almost an endless number of constructions, so to speak, of data manipulations. So you'd have mass quantities of propaganda being manipulated in different ways, and you would have mass numbers of organizations. So you could literally have great numbers of people who were considered as though independent, running their own thing. So giving people personalized power was something that the RGE Spy Institute was doing. This is where you end up having massive opportunities for people to allow them to think for one moment that somehow they're going to end up becoming incredibly successful in some way if they stick to the program. And the program is, we're deceiving most all the people to be dummies, to be pawns, to be wage slaves, to be serfs, to be slaves, basically, while some of us are going to go ahead and succeed. Well, this is not a philosophy that would be allowable under colonial constitutional capitalism. Now, some people will try to disagree with you and say, well, there's this. Well, what they're missing is certain key items, for instance, that are undeniable. Your ability as a citizen to use your own hands to build a roof over your head to protect you from the elements. This is crucial, absolutely crucial. Yet, when you look at people like Sanders, he is backing people to create large stacks of paperwork of all these so-called things that have to be done in order for someone to build the simplest house. And he's also backing massive permit fees. In California, it's $42,000. It starts at $42,000. So school taxes, this, that, the other thing, this permit, that fee, this other stuff, all these different costs. So, this is a mass problem because the simplicity of the original agreement is that no one was to tax you on your property. The way the government was to get money was by appraising your property and using the new appraisal for justification to print notes. Let's talk about that a little bit more thoroughly. Basically, as we had going into the revolution in the United States, we had the British would run around and they'd go, "Oh, you just built this new structure. This is wonderful. We need to do an appraisal on it." So they would appraise it, and based upon the fact that they were claiming that we are the military controllers, we are doing the ultimate control of government. Therefore, we claim the territory of treasury. So therefore, we are basically appraising this new asset that you have built, and we're using this assessment as part of our bookwork to justify the printing of new notes. So now we're going to spend it, said Britain, the way we want. And you have other people sitting there that got upset and said, wait a minute, these people are making bank off of us. Now, some people probably understand one factor about, people are making bank, and people go, that means they're making money off you. I want you to go back to a more original understanding. People are making bank off of you. If you go back to the Revolutionary War, you can understand that just prior to that, again, the British would make an accounting appraisal, an assessment of your property that you made, and use that for justification to print notes. And this is perhaps the earliest origin of they're making the term, they're making bank off of us. Because literally, that's what the British were doing. So when we decided to stand up, and we had a bunch of our stewards stand up and say, well, you know what? We're going to build our own treasury, and we're going to cut the British out. If you can imagine those very first meetings where you had people of means step up with other people that which today you'd call middle class or smaller landowners, and say, okay, we're going to cut the British out. We're no longer going to allow them to basically be the treasury. We're not going to allow them to assess our properties and justify it for making notes. We're going to make our own treasury. We're going to do our own appraisals on our property, and we're going to have permanent access to our own treasury for the purpose of growth, to continue to develop hard assets, real estate, ourselves. And people are like, ooh, that's quite a thought, but what you're saying is treason. They'll want to kill you for saying that. And you had people saying, well, hey, look, we've got a lot to lose right here. I mean, we could just find a way to sell out and go any place in the world and kick back forever, but we're going to go ahead and do this. And we want to see who's willing to risk and join us in this. So welcome to the beginning main understanding of the revolution that is virtually never properly taught in school. Literally. Almost nobody really understands this pivot value point, that we're going to make our own treasury and that we are going to control the access to that we are going to guarantee that our individual labor is 100% bankable to be able to borrow money and develop real estate. In other words, there's no such thing as credit rating. The loan is secured by the concept of understanding that what we're building as an asset, as the real estate, is the security. So when you can look at today and say, oh, we can build wholesale. We can build for 70 cents on the dollar of retail. It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? Yeah. So, yes. And by the way, you're paying yourself a wage as you're building your own home with your own hands. So the payment that you're giving yourself is an endless perpetuation of income. This means you're always generating work for yourself, always. And in many cases, people would sub a lot of stuff out. In other words, they would be owner-builder, but they would get other people to help them. And in many cases, they'd end up just paying other people to do the job, but they are the owner-builder contractor. And of course, you needed no licenses, no permits to do any of this. This was your inalienable right to do this. So these are crucially important items. Do you see anybody today standing up to defend your rights? To defend your right to use your own hands to build a roof over your head? That's a good question, isn't it? Let's rephrase that. How about to build a home, a structure of any kind over your head to protect yourself from the elements? What's happening in California? They say, no, you can't do that. And people say, but we don't know what to do. And says, well, you'll just have to find something. Well, what do we do? Oh, well, there has to be a this or a that. But the reality is they're just not addressing reality. They're saying all these things, they just don't add up. Don't make any sense. It's like, that doesn't make any sense, but you just keep telling us this, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't do anything for us. We have people dying in the street. Now, let's say, for instance, you're going to look at Greenland. We're trying to get Greenland to join us. Now, I've got a plan for that, by the way. I think it's a great plan, by the way. I think the idea of having Greenlanders join us is great. Okay, so let's talk about something about Greenland. Now, first of all, in the last 5 years, I think it's been 5 years since a homeless person actually died in Greenland. They basically do not have